Hey, how's it going, everybody? It's Timothy here with Mana Rocks, and we're going to be continuing our limited set review of Throne of Eldraine. This time, talking about the black cards. Every common, uncommon, rare, and mythic rare in the set. We will be ranking in categories, starting with the weakest cards and the sideboard cards, all the way up to what I consider to be the best bombs in black, the best cards you can possibly open within the color. And then we'll just give kind of a consensus of what the color is trying to do, what it pairs well with, so on and so forth. If you have not watched one of these videos before, I recommend going back and watching the white and blue reviews that I've already done. You can look at the playlist too, and hopefully we'll get one of these out per day leading up into the pre-release. If this is helpful for you, if any of this information is in any way useful, feel free to subscribe to the channel or show me that it's useful. Send a comment. Tell me in the comments below whether it was useful or not. That's always helpful. You can also find us on Twitter at MTG_Mana Rocks. And before we get started, I just want to go ahead and point out again that this is my personal opinion about the cards. I haven't played with the cards, obviously. Pre-release has not happened yet as of the recording of this video, so this is just kind of an initial take on how I feel like the cards are going to play out. But it might be wildly different than how I'm viewing these cards, and I might just get some cards completely wrong. That happens with a few every single set. So let's go ahead and jump in. Reminder that we are going to start with what I call the sideline cards. These are cards that you're not main decking unless you have a really strong reason to do so. They're usually build around cards that require the right kind of supporting cast of cards in order to really shine. We'll see this with some of the food cards in particular. Maybe not in this video, but in some of them. And this also includes the sideboard cards that you don't usually include in your main board, but when you do bring them in, they're not just complete duds. They actually have a pretty profound effect on the game. So we'll see that right away, actually. I should have mentioned this in the other videos, but this is part of a cycle, Specters Shriek. There is one card in each color that kind of hates on its own color. We saw this with the protection from white creature in white, and also the Mana Leak counterspell that costs less to cast if it targets a blue spell. But this is going to be the black version of that cycle. Specters Shriek is a single black mana. It is an uncommon sorcery. It says target opponent reveals their hand. You may choose a non-land card from it. If you do, that player exiles that card. If a non-black card is exiled this way, exile a card from your hand. So on the base level, if you are not taking a black card out of your opponent's hand with the Specters Shriek, you are going to lose both the Shriek and you're going to lose some other card from your hand. So you're 2 for 1 in yourself to Thoughtseize your opponent. That is not good. I don't care how bomby your opponent's deck is, that's not a winning strategy. However, if you take a black card, this is just a free Thoughtseize, a 1-mana Thoughtseize to take your opponent's best card out of their hand, assuming that their best card is black. So this is not a card I recommend main boarding. Sometimes you see this a lot in M20 currently, where people will main deck a Fry or an Ether Gust, and they'll get you every now and then, but you know that against other opponents they just have a dead card, and that's how Specters Shriek works out. It's not like the rest of the cycle where it does something very profound on its own. This does need to be played against black decks for it to really shine. There's one extra little note I want to go ahead and say with this card. It is a May ability. You do get to look at your opponent's hand, and then you have the option to choose whether or not you're going to take a card out of their hand. Most of the time, if you're casting Specters Shriek, you're going to take a card out of their hand. You might have an extra land in your hand, something you don't mind losing. But let's say that you're playing against a black-white deck, and you cast Specters Shriek, and it just so happens that your opponent is holding all white cards and they don't have a black card when you weren't expecting to have to lose an extra card to Thoughtseize them. You can choose not to take one of the cards from your opponent's hand, and then you don't have to exile a card from your hand. That's still pretty bad. You're down the Specters Shriek for basically no value, just the information of looking at your opponent's hand, but it is something to keep in mind if things go horribly awry when your opponent reveals their hand. Next up is Cauldron Familiar. This is definitely a build around card. It requires a lot of food to be good because on its own it's pretty bad. It is a single black mana. It is an uncommon, and it is a 1/1 cat. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent loses 1 life, and you gain 1 life. So that's the base card you're getting, a 1-mana 1/1 that drains your opponent for 1 life when it enters the battlefield. Definitely not a good card on its own. There aren't really sacrifice effects in this format, or at least not a ton of them in this format that you're going to be able to take advantage of having this extra 1/1 body on board. So that's not great. There's a little bit of an extra bonus here, and I've mentioned in the other videos that food is more prevalent in black and in green than it is in the other colors, and Cauldron Familiar is one of the cards that can use your food. It says sacrifice a food, return the Cauldron Familiar from your graveyard to the battlefield. So somehow if you end up in a deck that's able to generate a bunch of food, this card becomes pretty decent and a minor roadblock for the opponent. You can just keep bringing it back. It whittles away at their life total, and then if you find some sort of recursive way to make food, you can actually start bringing the familiar back enough times that it becomes a real threat to your opponent. It actually, sacrifice 4 food, you get 4 life drain off of this. And then you get a bunch of chump blocks from the cat as well. You can do it at instant speed as well, which is kind of neat, but overall you need an abundance of food, and it is worth noting that there are much better cards that will also require you to use your food, and I think you're much better served by using your food with those cards than you are by using it with a Cauldron Familiar. So bottom line here, don't play this card unless you have a ton of ways to create food in your deck, and even then I think you're looking for a slightly better payoff. Wishclaw Talisman, not really a card I want to spend a lot of time talking about. It's 1 in a black for a rare artifact. It enters the battlefield with 3 wish counters. You can pay 1, tap it, and remove a wish counter to search your library for any card and put it into your hand, and then you give your opponent the Wishclaw Talisman. You can only activate this at sorcery speed, or rather you can only activate it during your turn. You can do it at instant speed, which is kind of interesting, but won't come up too often. This is very, very similar to Scheme Symmetry from M20. I don't think that was a particularly playable card unless you had some super bomb like Chandra or something like that, and Wishclaw Talisman is going to be the same. The kind of neat thing here is this doesn't immediately give your opponent anything outside of just the Wishclaw Talisman. They have to activate it, and if they do, they have to give you back the Talisman, so you can then get the 3rd activation, take the 3rd wish counter off, and get to tutor again. Normally, I'm not a big fan of this sort of thing, since you're just using Wishclaw Talisman as a demonic tutor, but you're giving your opponent access to a demonic tutor. It's got a nice little tug of war effect, where if your opponent really, really wants to get the value off of it and make it so that you didn't just get straight up demonic tutor, they have to give you another shot at searching your library, and that could be pretty bad. Plus, by the time you activate it the second time, they will regain control of the Talisman, but it won't have any counters, so they don't get to activate the effect anymore. Kind of an interesting card. I don't think it's particularly good. Again, I'm not a big fan of tutors in Limited unless you have really, really good cards to get, or if you end up with some sort of toolbox deck, and I don't think that's going to pan out too well. It plays nicely if you have sacrifice effects that can sacrifice artifacts, since you can activate it and then you can sacrifice the artifact in response, but I don't know how many of those there are. There's not that many, so I'm not really looking to play Wishclaw Talisman, but if you have a very bomby deck, I could see worse cards making the cut. The Cauldron of Eternity is next. This is our black mythic rare in the legendary artifact cycle. It is 10 black, 12 mana total. It costs 2 less to cast for each creature in your graveyard, and it says whenever a creature you control dies, put it on the bottom of its owner's library. So that's going to actually counteract the last ability here, which is 2 in a black, tap, and pay 2 life. So 3 mana, tap it, pay 2 life. Return target creature from your graveyard to the battlefield. You can only activate it at sorcery speed. So there's a little bit of a, again, a tug of war effect here, a push and pull. Because you want to reanimate your creatures with the last ability. That's clearly the effect you're getting here, is 3 mana, 2 life, tap it, reanimate a creature, put it straight onto the battlefield. Pretty good. But the problem, of course, is that any additional creatures that die after that will go to the bottom of their owner's libraries. So you won't be able to get additional creatures into the graveyard. Basically, what the Cauldron of Eternity says is when it enters the battlefield, the creatures that are currently in your graveyard at the time that it enters, you have access to reanimate those creatures, but you're probably not getting access to any more, since other creatures will now go to the bottom of your library. You can get around this a little bit by self-milling. It only puts creatures on the bottom of your library if the creature dies, right? So if the creature goes to the graveyard because you discarded it or because it was milled, you still have access to those. Those will stay in the graveyard. And we mentioned before that blue-black in particular has an archetype of milling yourself, milling the opponent as well, which can be dangerous. And if you can combine those cards to get the Cauldron out, I don't know, for 6 mana, then I could see this being a playable card. But I do think it's a little bit too much jumping through hoops to get this card to work. Throughout a normal limited game, the graveyard does fill up, but there aren't usually 5 creatures in the graveyard later in the game. Maybe if the games just vary back and forth, then sure, but there's usually 2 or 3 floating around, and that means that the Cauldron's still going to be pretty hefty price to get out. This could be a board stall breaker, though, just having the access of reanimating the first 5 or 6 creatures that died during the course of your game, and any additional ones that get milled could be good, but it remains to be seen whether this is going to be a strong card or not. I'm leaning towards probably a little bit too much work, but if you can somehow concoct a deck that can turbo this out really quickly or mill yourself a lot, then sure, try it out and let me know how it goes, but I'm staying away from it for now. All right, so moving into our low pick category, these are cards that I'm not super excited about, but I will play them even though I'm looking to get them much, much later in the pack. First up, Smitten Swordmaster. This is a knight payoff, and it does go way up in value if you have a lot of knights in your deck. As is, I'm not super impressed. It's 1 in a black for a 2/1 lifelinker. It's a common human knight. So you have Child of Night, right? 2 mana, 2/1 lifelinker. Fine card, not something I'm ever clamoring for. It gets punished by all of the 1/1s that white can make and stuff like that. Any pingers that show up in this format really punish this card. It's fine though. Like, if you're playing a knight deck, you will take basically anything that has the word knight on it, and this will fit the bill. Now, in a dedicated knight deck, you actually have a very good adventure attached to this. It's Curry Favor, not Curry Flavor. It's a single black mana for a sorcery. You gain X life, and each opponent loses X life, where X is the number of knights you control. A little bit awkward because this card will not be on the battlefield when you cast that sorcery or when you cast that adventure. But, if you have 2 knights on the battlefield, then for 3 mana, you get to drain them for 2, and then you get to cast the Smitten Swordmaster. That's fine, right? The adventure cost is cheap enough that basically anytime you have any number of knights on the battlefield, you're just going to go ahead and cast the sorcery half and then cast the creature half and make this a 3 mana card with basically a little life drain attached to a Child of Night. And that's not a terrible card, but you do need a bunch of knights in your deck before this becomes an actively good card. If you're just draining for 1 for an additional mana, that's really not that impressive, and I'm not super impressed. Plus, Child of Night is not a card I typically like very much, so that's where I stand on this. If it's easy to get, 10 plus knights in a deck, then this could actually turn into a threatening card, especially in multiples, but we'll see how the format plays out. If you can get that many knights, it'll go up in value. If you're just playing this in your average black deck, it's a pretty mediocre card. Reaper of Night, 5, black, 7 mana for a 4/5. Whenever it attacks, if defendant player has 2 or fewer cards in hand, the Reaper of Night gains flying until end of turn. So if your opponent is close to Hellbent, 2 or fewer cards in hand, then you have paid 7 mana for a 4/5 flyer. And sure, that can get the job done, but that's not exactly a premium rate. I don't want to pay more than 6 mana for my big flyer if it doesn't have any super strong abilities attached to it. And this sometimes won't even have flying. It'll just be a ground beater if your opponent has any number of cards above 2 in their hand. And blue does have a lot of ways to draw cards, so this is going to be a little bit lame against blue as well. It does have an adventure, though. It's Mind Rot for 4 mana. Harvest Fear, 2 in a black, sorcery, target opponent discards 2 cards. I mean, sure, right? This is common for a reason. It's super clunky. The combination of abilities, you kind of get it, right? You Mind Rot your opponent, and then you play this big creature that cares about your opponent having fewer cards in hand. But there's such a gap between the time you're going to cast the sorcery and the time you're going to cast the creature. Casting a 7-drop doesn't always happen on turn 7. Sometimes it's turn 9 or 10. And if your opponent saw that you Mind Rotted them with an expensive Mind Rot nonetheless, 4 mana is not where I want to pay. Where I want to be for that sort of effect, then, they have a lot of time to prep and just keep a couple extra cards in their hand before the Reaper of Night comes down. And it's not too hard to tussle with a 4/5 on board if it doesn't have flying, right? So your opponent has a little bit more control over this card than you do. There's not a lot of discard to really help it along. And even when you do help it along, it's not like it's some game-winning bomb. So it's a common. You'll probably play 1 in your deck, but you definitely don't want more than 1 of these. Lash of Thorns, a weird combat trick. It's a single black mana. It's a common instant. Target creature gets +2/+1 and gains Death Touch until end of turn. I'm not a big fan of combat tricks that don't pump your toughness a lot because it usually means your creature is still going to die. The problem with this one is that +1 toughness just, it doesn't save your creature in combat, right? Now, clearly the upside is that giving it Death Touch means that your creature is going to trade with whatever it's blocking or whatever's blocking it, so on and so forth. If your creature has Trample, then you get to deal a bunch of extra damage, but for the most part, given Death Touch and power pumping abilities doesn't really make a lot of sense. This is a fine combat trick if you're relying on like 0/4s and 0/3s and 0/5s and stuff like that, because it lets your walls actually kill a creature, because your opponent's just going to attack into your walls anyway. They don't normally threaten it. But this is a weak combat trick. I'm not super excited about it. A lot of times when you cast it, you will take something out, but at the expense of 2-for-1 in yourself, and that's not where I want to be with my combat tricks. Giant's Skewer is up next, another colored equipment. This one is 1 and a black, and the equip cost is 3 mana. So this 3 mana equip cost, that's pretty expensive. So what do you get out of it is the question you need to be asking. Well, the equipped creature gets +2/+1. That's okay, right? That's not a really huge bump or anything like that. If you're playing evasive creatures, it's definitely a lot better, but 3 mana to equip and give a kind of marginal power toughness bump, that's usually a whole turn, right? You're probably not casting too many other spells the turn you equip, since it is an expensive equip cost. There is a little bit of a bonus. Whenever the equipped creature deals combat damage to a creature, create a food token. Okay, well, that's a little awkward too, right? So normally your equipment, you want to throw it on a creature that's evasive and then get in extra damage, but you don't make the food unless you're actually dealing combat damage to other creatures, and your opponent knows that, right? They can see the giant skewer on board, so they get to kind of determine whether they're going to block or not and give you a food token. And then if you have other food payoffs, your opponent might just say, oh, I'll take the extra damage, you don't get a food, and you spent your whole turn to do like 2 extra damage to me. There's a lot of tempo plays in this format too. We saw a lot of bounce spells in blue, and that makes me a little bit weary of expensive equipment like this. This doesn't have a free equip like a lot of the other equipment in the set, so that's a little bit of a turnoff here. If you are playing a food deck and you have evasive creatures, or you have creatures that your opponent is going to be incentivized to block, this gets a little bit better, but for the most part, this is a flavor card, and I don't think I'm going to be playing it too often. Forever Young is 1 and a black. It is a common sorcery. Put any number of target creature cards from your graveyard on top of your library and draw a card. So this is basically a sorcery speed Grave Purge or Foot Bottom Feast if you've played with those cards. It is 1 mana cheaper. I believe those cards are all 3 mana, and it's still not that great. For the most part, this is Raise Dead, right? For 2 mana, you can take a creature out of your graveyard and essentially put it in your hand. Sure, you're going to put it on top of your library, but then you're going to draw it right away. This isn't really even a cantrip, right? You can cycle this for 2 mana if you have no creatures in your graveyard. It doesn't necessarily have to have a target. Sometimes you get to go off with a card like this. Your opponent's killed like your 2 or 3 best creatures, or maybe you milled yourself or something like that, and then you get to use Forever Young to kind of stack your library. But that gives your opponent information, and it doesn't give you the cards right away. It gives you the first one, but I'm not super stoked about this. If you are getting multiple creatures back, though, especially if you're playing on Arena or Moto or something like that, make sure you stack the cards right so that you draw the one you want to draw. I think this is cheap enough, and Raise Deads are a lot better when you have bombs or cheap aggressive creatures, so be on the lookout for those decks. In just your average run-of-the-mill deck, I think you can do a little bit better than this. Festive Funeral is up next. This should maybe be a tiny notch above where I have it, but I feel like this card is going to be disappointing a decent amount of the time. It's 4 and a black for a common instant. Target creature gets -X/-X until end of turn, where X is the number of cards in your graveyard. This is more of like a build-around removal spell than it is just a solid removal spell. We're used to our 5 mana black instant removal spells just saying destroy a target creature, right? Maybe give me a little bonus on top of that. This doesn't do that, and sometimes this doesn't even kill the thing you want it to kill. Plus, there are times where your graveyard is empty or you don't have a lot of cards in your graveyard, and this is way overcosted, maybe given -3/-3 or something like that. Sure, 5 mana -3/-3 is playable, but it's not exactly a premium common, right? And even when this is -10, or, even a more absurd number, it's at best a 1-for-1, right? Which is what I expect out of my 5-mana removal spell anyway. So if you're in a deck that's going to very reliably get cards into your own graveyard, or you can stall out the game long enough that this is going to be -3, -4, -5 on average or better, then it's a playable card. But I don't think you want to go all in on this. This is not Murder, right? This is not Witch's Caress. This is not, a Deadly Visit or anything like that. It's very clunky, and it doesn't really pay you off for going all in on the strategy by just giving you a single target removal spell. Eye Collector is up next. Black mana for a 1/1 common fairy. It's a flyer, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, each player puts the top card of their library into their graveyard. So again, supporting kind of that self-mill strategy while also supporting the blue-black theme of milling the opponent for your kind of threshold effects, right? If you're not taking advantage of either of those things, if you don't care about milling yourself or you don't care about milling the opponent, this card kind of sucks, right? But you will know when you want this thing. I do want to point out that blue, black, and even green and white, there's a bunch of fairies in this set, and people are like, oh, Eldraine is a fairy set, but there's no fairy payoff. There's no reason to force fairies or anything like that. No tribal synergies or anything. So don't be thrown off by the fact that this is fairy. It doesn't really matter. For the most part, if you want mill effects for either yourself or your opponent, this is playable. But even then, it's one of the worst versions of this card you can get. Revenge of Ravens is up next. 3 and a black for an uncommon enchantment. Whenever a creature attacks you or a planeswalker you control, that creature's controller loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So just quick shout out for two-headed giant purposes. I want to get my two-headed giant nug in there. This card does not work in two-headed giant. When you attack in two-headed giant, you get to choose which player you're attacking, and then whatever damage is dealt, it's just dealt to the team's total. So you can just attack the player who doesn't have Revenge of Ravens, and it'll never do anything unless you're attacking their planeswalker. But come on, that's not going to come up. So just wanted to go and give that side note real quick. As for normal limited, 1v1 draft limit, sealed, whatever, these sorts of effects are usually pretty weak. It lets your opponent kind of control when they attack you. They will just stop attacking you with small creatures and wait until they have bigger creatures. There are some sort of decks that this kind of hoses quite a bit, right? If your opponent is playing the type of deck that just curves out with 2/2s, 3/3s, 1/1, stuff like that, then this shuts down all of their 1/1s. Their 1/1s no longer deal damage, essentially. You gain the life before they deal combat damage. Their 2/2s are nerfed, and your opponent's losing life for attacking you, too. So it's pretty good in a race. It's also pretty good in multiple, so maybe there's something there. I don't think you want to take this card early, but I think you want to board it in against very aggressive decks, not against control decks. It doesn't do enough. And if you are a very good control deck yourself, you can probably manage the board better without having something like this. But I do think there's something here, and if you do get multiples, I would definitely consider it. But on its own as a standalone card, it's just kind of fine, and it might end up just not being super relevant against really big creatures. Cauldron's Gift is up next, another uncommon. This is 4 and a black for a sorcery. You choose a creature card in your graveyard. If you do, return it to the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it. It has Adamant as well, which I should have probably read first because it comes first. But if you spend at least 3 black mana to cast this spell, you mill yourself for 4 first. And notice that the Cauldron's Gift does not target anything in your graveyard, so you don't have to choose before you mill yourself. You can mill yourself with the Adamant clause, and then if you mill something better than what you already had in your graveyard, you can reanimate that. The Adamant, it doesn't care whether you have Adamant or not, as towards whether you're going to get that +1/+1 counter. That's just going to happen anyway. But I'm never a big fan of these cards. Rise from the Grave. I like those sorts of effects, these 5 mana reanimation effects, a lot better when they can target creatures out of your opponent's graveyard, and this one just can't, right? So if you're playing a black deck and you just don't have huge creatures or big bombs to reanimate, this is 5 mana to maybe get 3 or 4 mana's worth of a creature with a +1/+1 counter on it, and that's not significantly better than just having another 5 mana 5/5 in your hand or something along those lines. Sometimes you'll get a bigger creature, sometimes you won't have a creature that's worth reanimating at all, and this will just be kind of stuck in your hand. Adamant, not a super huge bonus, but again, if you want to mill yourself out, then it's fine. Overall, I'm not super impressed with the card, but it's playable. It is another version of a creature in your deck, essentially. And if you're playing green-black and you just happen to have like big stompy creatures, then it does get a little bit better. All right, moving on into the solid playable category. These are the cards I'm looking to pick up in the middle of the pack. They normally don't wheel. I'm kind of excited to play them, and they usually make up the nuts and bolts of your limited deck. First up, Wicked Guardian. 3 and a black for a 4/2 common human noble. When it enters the battlefield, you may have it deal 2 damage to another creature you control. If you do, draw a card. So a couple things here. First off, if you're just killing one of your own creatures, if it's something that's even remotely relevant, this card loses a lot of its value. Obviously, the stand-up play and what you really want to do is get some sort of 3 or 4 toughness creature on board, and then, just ping that for 2, and then this becomes a 4/2 that cantrips. Which is pretty good for 4 mana. Now, a 4 mana 4/2 that doesn't cantrip, has no abilities, that's a pretty poor card, actually a very bad card in general, but if you get to cantrip off of it, that becomes a real card. So it takes a little bit of setup, but if the setup is there, or if you have kind of a dorky 1/1 laying around that's lost its value, it's not attacking or blocking anyway, you can turn that into a card with Wicked Guardian, which is fine. Another thing I want to note is that you target the creature, and then upon resolution of Wicked Guardian, you get to choose whether you're dealing 2 damage to it. So let's say you have a 3/3 on board, and you target it, and then your opponent deals 2 damage to the 3/3, assuming that the Wicked Guardian's now going to kill it. You have the option to say, oh, okay, well, Wicked Guardian's resolving, I'm going to go ahead and say no to the ability, and then you don't get to draw the card, but you also don't lose the creature, and your opponent's down their shock effect. So just a little thing that can come up and might come up, but overall I think this card's fine. You don't want a bunch of these, especially since they don't exactly play well with each other, and if you do have this sort of effect, you want either expendable creatures, which is not a prevalent thing in this set, or you want high toughness creatures. So maybe blue-black is where this card is going to play best. Tempting Witch is up next. 2 and a black for a 1/3 common human warlock. When it enters the battlefield, create a food token. And for 2 mana, you can tap it and sacrifice a food token. Target player loses 3 life. Now, this is a food payoff that I'm really interested in. 3 mana 1/3 is what's dragging it down, right? And this is kind of a build-around sort of effect, or rather a build-around creature, but I think there's something here, right? Again, there aren't tons of ways to just make food over and over again or make a bunch of food, but if you can get, 3, 4 food throughout the course of the game and sacrifice it, this thing adds up a lot of damage to the opponent. 3, 6, 9 life, right? You just cut your opponent's life total in half if you manage to sacrifice 3 food. Of course, sacrificing food is resource management, right? You might actually need to gain life off of the food. You can't use the food for both effects, so you gotta manage your resources and decide which creatures are going to be sacrificing your food for which effects. As far as I'm concerned, Tempting Witch is one of the better ways to do it, and in a dedicated food deck that's able to make food throughout the course of the game, this can be a win con, and I feel like it's going to play out just fine. Memory Theft is up next. 2 and a black for a common sorcery. Target opponent reveals their hand, and that's the card. Just kidding. You choose a non-land card from it, they discard that card, and then you get an extra bonus that you may put a card that has an adventure from that player's exile zone into their graveyard. So you get to unadventure one of their creatures, which is kind of neat, right? So as it stands, these 3 mana discard spells that we're seeing in Limited lately, Dark Inquiry from Rivals of Ixalan, and what is it? The one from War of the Spark with the Amass one, that one was really good. These effects have kind of grown on me. Cards get better and better and rely a lot on kind of their top end cards to kind of either stabilize or win the game, and these 3 mana plays can really strip your opponent out of a key strategy, especially in very synergistic sets. It's not a premium, right? You don't want to play 2 memory thefts or 3 memory thefts or anything like that. It's just not that good, but being able to trade 3 mana, which is a big cost, a big tempo hit for you, for something that could potentially devastate you, is pretty good. Not something you want to go all in on. Again, don't play more than 1 memory theft if you even want that sort of effect at all. Board it out against aggro decks. Don't board this in against adventures. It's not really the appeal of the card, right? Even though that is a nice little bonus. Being able to strip your opponent's best card from their hand and basically killing a creature, preemptively killing a creature that's on an adventure, is pretty sweet. even though, again, I don't think you should go all in on it, and it's not really a huge incentive for me to sideboard this card in if my opponent has a bunch of adventure creatures. Next up is Malevolent Noble, 1 and a black for a 2/2. It's a common human noble. For 2 mana, you may sacrifice another artifact or creature and put a +1/+1 counter on it. So this is one of the only sacrifice outlets in the entire set. It's not a particularly good one, but it is nice that it gets counters rather than just a temporary buff, so you can kind of throw your cat into this, right? This is what I was talking about at the beginning of the video with the Cauldron cat, that there aren't a lot of sacrifice effects or ways to use expendable bodies. The Malevolent Noble can also sacrifice food, which is decent if you have a bunch of excess food and you don't have the type of deck with cards like Tempting Witch that are going to use your food for other things. Then sure, you can convert those into +1/+1 counters, but this is a pretty all-in card, and it's an expensive mana activation for this sort of effect, so I'm not super impressed by it. But I do think if you want a sacrifice outlet, if you want some extra way to take advantage of kind of little nuisance bodies on board, or you need some sort of recursion engine going, then Malevolent Noble is going to be your card. Also, some pretty unsettling flavor text on that one. Lost Legion's up next. This one's pretty simple. It's 1 black for a 2/3. It's a Spirit Knight at common, and when it enters the battlefield, scry 2. So the double black does make this a little bit harder to cast, but it's a knight, and it paves the way. I said this with basically any creature that comes down and has scry 2 attached to it. That's just a nice little effect. You feel pretty good when you get to scry 2, because if you're playing this on turn 3, you get to make sure that you're either hitting your land drops or scrying extra lands to the bottom and kind of just finding what you need to keep the game progressing. And if you draw it late in the game where a 3 mana 2/3 is just not going to be the most prevalent thing on board, then you get to scry towards some extra action and get bonus lands out of the way, which is quite nice. So night decks are going to want this quite a bit, but I think your dedicated black deck is just going to play basically any number of copies of this that you get. Lochthwain Paladin is up next, 3 and a black for a 3/2 common human knight with Menace, and this is our black common in the Adamant +1/+1 counter cycle. So if you spent at least 3 black mana to cast the spell, it comes in with a +1/+1 counter on it. 4 mana, 3/2 Menace is a playable but not very good card, since your opponent can throw like 2 2/2s in front of it, and it's going to trade for just one of them. So not the best thing in the world, even though it is a knight. If you get a +1/+1 counter on this, which is not that hard to do, right? You just need 3/4 of the mana you spend on it to be black. Then you get a 4/3 Menace, which is a much better card. It still trades with 2 2/2s, but you can see the difference right there, right? You get to trade 2 for 1 in that scenario, whereas you get to trade 1 for 1 in the earlier scenario, despite having paid the same amount of mana for both situations. Again, anything that says knight on it is going to be relevant, so this is a fine card, but you do want to be heavy black when you're playing this card, and just make sure that you can curve out into it on turn 4 reliably. Foreboding Fruit is our next one, 2 and a black for a common sorcery. Target player draws 2 cards and loses 2 life. Okay, Sign in Blood. Adamant bonus says if at least 3 black mana was spent to cast this spell, create a food token. That's a fine little bonus, especially since that food token can recuperate the life loss from the card if that's the way you want to use the food, right? I keep talking about build-arounds with food and stuff, but sometimes you just want extra life out of your food and you'll prolong the game. So aggro decks might have a tough time in this format if everybody's actually just gaining a bunch of life off of extra food. But how do I feel about this card? 3 mana for a Sign in Blood is pretty good. There are times when you can target your opponent to just put them in lethal range, which doesn't come up nearly as often, but I would say a good 1 in every 10 Foreboding Fruits will target the opponent. In Two-Headed Giant, you can target your partner, wink wink. But yeah, I think the Adamant bonus is fine. This does cost triple black if you want the Adamant bonus, but this isn't one where I need Adamant for the card to be playable. I will just cast a Forbidden Fruit in basically any black deck as a good little 2 for 1, and if I'm not in like tons and tons of pressure, then the loss of 2 life can be recuperated by just having good stabilizing cards or extra life gain in your deck. So I like this card. Play 1 to 2 copies, and if you are a food deck, make sure that you can achieve the Adamant bonus to get that extra food out of it. All right, and for what I believe is the last card in this category, we have Barrow Witches, 4 and a black for a 3/4 common human warlock, and when it enters the battlefield, return target knight card from your graveyard to your hand. So It's a little bit weird to have this random human warlock that cares about knights, but you know when you want this card in your deck. If you have 4, 5+ knights or something like that, then this is a card that you're pretty happy to curve into, especially since a lot of your knights will trade off early. They're pretty aggressive cards. If you don't have a lot of knights, if you have like 2 or 3, then this is a card you can pass on. It is really good when you get the knight off of it, right? If you don't, you're paying 5 mana for a 3/4, which is pretty dreadful. But if you do get a knight back, then this is just a beefier Gravedigger, and that's not necessarily a bad thing either. Again, use your discretion on this card. You will know when you want to play it. And I guess we have other cards in this category as well. Whoops. Foulmire Knight is up next. It's a single black mana for a 1/1 Death Touch. It's an uncommon zombie knight. I like these sorts of cards. Sedge Scorpion, Typhoid Rats, whatever you want to call this card. Freaka's Chosen, I don't know. 1/1 Death Touchers tend to get the job done. They always trade for something, whether it's a removal spell, whether it's a creature, even a dorky creature. Your 1 mana card always trades for something, and that's pretty nice, right? The only time these cards are bad is if your opponent is playing nothing but evasive creatures, and then it gets to attack pretty freely, which is not nothing, right? This one happens to have an adventure attached to it, which is an instant. I was playing this one as a sorcery on Arena, but it is an instant. Profane Insight is 2 and a black for an instant. You draw a card and you lose a life, right? That's not really a profound effect, but on top of a card that you're happy to play anyway, you're pretty happy to have this. The interesting thing is when it comes to like turn 3 and this is your only play, are you supposed to just cast Profane Insight or do you get the body on board? I'm leaning towards you should almost always try to cast Profane Insight with this card. So if this is in your opening hand and you can cast it on turn 1 or you draw it on turn 2, I still think you should probably hold off and cast the Profane Insight on turn 3 and then cast this with some other spell on turn 4. And then you turn this into a 2-for-1 rather than just a 1-for-1 that's going to trade for something dorky, right? If your opponent's playing the most hyper-aggressive deck in the world, then you might have to reconsider that. But I think the line of play is almost always try to get the instant out of this first. This is also a decent adventure to recur with any of the cards that let you reuse adventures, even though most of the time you're going to trade this off with a lot of things. There are some fight spells, there are some ways to turn that Death Toucher into a real threat, but for the most part, this is a perfectly playable card. I'm happy to have a decent number of them since it can cantrip on top of being a relevant body. Bell of the Brawl is up next, 2 and a black for a 3/2 uncommon human knight with menace. All right, 3 mana 3/2. I'm definitely right there. Not too much far off from just like a 3 mana 3/3, right? It gets to attack past single blockers, which is nice, and it has a nice little attack bonus whenever Bell of the Brawl attacks. Other knights you control get +1/+0 until end of turn. So in a dedicated knight deck, or even a deck that happens to be running just a couple other knights, this is a pretty good card. It's uncommon for a reason. They stack well. It's a knight that you're very happy to just curve into, and it's going to be relevant at basically all points in the game. Menace makes it an actual threat as well. If your other knights are getting pumped, they might be more threatening, and your opponent will actually have to put blockers there, which makes your Bell of the Brawl stick around and makes the menace on it even more relevant. So I like the design of this card. It's not super overpowered, but it does pay you off for drafting extra knights, and there's a decent number of knights floating around, so you can definitely make this card work out. And into our high power level cards. There's quite a few strong cards in black, and we'll talk about that in the next category, but for the most part, we're going to start getting into the cards that you're really excited to play when you're playing black. The first one is Reef Sol. This is a reprint. It's 1 and a black. It's a common sorcery, destroy target creature with power 3 or less. So overall, there are a lot of smaller creatures in this set, especially since a lot of the adventure creatures have extra bonuses tacked onto them. They kind of balance that by making the creature half of the card a little bit weaker. So Reef Sol is going to get anything from like your opponent's 1-drop up to a couple 5-drops, you know, think like the Unicorn or the Barrow Witch or whatever. And that's pretty solid. You can't ask for much more. It's sorcery. It has a little bit of a restriction on it, but this was in a couple other sets. It was in, I believe, M15. It was in one of the master sets, I think maybe Iconic Masters, and it was good in both of those sets. I expect it to be pretty good here, and a solid early pick removal spell. Bake into a pie is a lot more what you're looking for when it comes to your common destroy target creature effect, right? 2 black, it's a common instant, destroy target creature, create a food token. Very, very relevant at all points in the game. Very relevant against aggro decks since that food can gain you extra life, and just a nice card, right? This is the type of card that you will play basically any number of them as you can get. Double black is a little bit of a deterrent, so I tend to like when our 4-mana removal spell is double black. That way people can't just take all of them and splash them. And if you find that black is open, you might get rewarded with a card. Pretty simple. This is what I was talking about when I was talking about the 5 mana -X to a creature equal to the number of cards in your graveyard. That's just always going to be worse than bake into a pie. Not 100% always, but for the most part, you will almost always take a bake into a pie before you take that card. Order of Midnight is actually one of the most powerful adventure creatures in the set at non-rare. It's 1 and a black for a 2/2 flyer that can't block. It's an uncommon human knight. So relevant creature type, very aggressive body, 2 mana 2/2 flyer. That's really good. You don't even care that it can't block because you're going to be attacking with this sort of card anyway. And if you play a 2 mana 2/2 flyer on turn 2, that's often responsible for 6 to 8 damage if your opponent doesn't play a lot of flyers themselves. But there's an adventure tacked on. Alter Fate is 1 and a black for a sorcery. Return target creature from your graveyard to your hand. So 2 mana to raise dead, and then 2 mana to cast this. That's a 4 mana flying Gravedigger, and Gravedigger is also just a premium card. Like, Gravedigger is a card you're always playing, right? So why not a flying Gravedigger? And I don't mean to overshadow the unable to block part, because sometimes that is a downside, especially if you are playing against an aggressive deck, especially if you're looking to play an attrition game and you just want to trade off resources as much as possible. But this gives you a creature back, your best creature back to your hand. It's cheap enough that you could do that and then play whatever creature you got back and then use 2 mana later in another turn to just cast the Order of Midnight. They play very well together if you have multiples. You get to kind of just keep looping them. And yeah, I think this card is just going to be fantastic. I think Order of Midnight is going to be the type of uncommon where if you don't open a super strong rare in your pack, you're going to be happy to first pick this one. Epic Downfall is up next. It's 1 and a black for an uncommon sorcery. It's another removal spell. Exile target creature with converted mana cost 3 or greater. So we just saw Reef Sol, which kills creatures power 3 or less. And then this one kills creatures with converted mana cost 3 or greater. So yeah, you can see a little bit of a dynamic there. Obviously, this one is an exile effect on top of being just a solid removal spell. It's cheap. It's still sorcery speed, so there's no like super blowout potential or anything like that. But it kills almost anything you really care about killing. You don't want to use your removal spells on 1-drops and 2-drops anyway. So you usually want to end up killing your opponent's big creatures, and being able to just 2 mana yeet whatever creature your opponent has out of the way and exile it permanently seems really, really strong to me. This is easily first pickable removal. Think Eternal Isolation from M20. Just to kind of gauge how good this card is. That hit creatures power 4 or greater, and it put it on the bottom of their library so they could potentially shuffle and draw again. This is just way better than that. It gets rid of the creature permanently, so they're never getting it back, and it hits a wider range of creatures, being converted mana cost 3 or greater rather than 4 or greater. Very good card, very solid, easily first pickable removal spell, which is kind of a theme for black, right? Bake into a Pie, Epic Downfall, Reef Sol, just very solid removal spells in black. Bog Naughty is up next. 3 black for a 3/3 uncommon fairy with flying. So 5 mana 3/3 flyer is kind of a standard rate. That's a decent card. For 2 and a black, you can sacrifice a food. Target creature gets -3/-3 until end of turn. This card is absurdly good. Somebody, when this card was spoiled in the comments on the spoiler site, said, did this card deserve to be uncommon? It's 5 mana. Yes, this card absolutely deserves to be uncommon. It's pushing rare territory, and I wouldn't be surprised if this ends up being one of, if not the best uncommon in the set. If you can make any amount of food tokens, this is just going to snipe down creatures. It's going to be a must kill on site. Otherwise, you get to turn your food into removal spells, and at a pretty reasonable cost too, right? 3 mana, sack a food, kill a creature seems really strong to me. Now, Bog Naughty's a little bit interesting because it doesn't make any food itself, so it's not like it's its own self-contained engine. You have to make food through other means, but there's plenty of ways to do that. I don't recommend playing extremely bad food cards like that white enchantment just to make Bognaughty work, because it is still a 5-mana 3/3 flyer. It doesn't need a lot of help, but play your decent food cards, feel this, get this out, and start sniping down your opponent's creatures. Also note that -3/-3 can be used as a combat trick, even though it's an onboard trick, but it can make combat really difficult for your opponent. I think Bognaughty is going to be fantastic, and again, I have to wait and see whether the food strategy is going to really pan out in Limited, if you can get a quote-unquote food deck, or if it's just a thing that'll come up every now and then. And one last thing before we move on, remember that there's all these different effects that are vying for your food, right? One thing wants you to sacrifice your food to reanimate something. One thing wants you to sack your food to deal damage to the opponent. One, like Bognaughty, wants to sack your food to kill creatures. You have to manage the resources and see what the better option is at the time, and don't just go slinging your food away to get your Cauldron cats back, because you might have a card like this which can use that food a little bit better in the late game. Witch's Vengeance is up next. 1 black for a rare sorcery. Creatures of the creature type of your choice get -3 until end of turn. So obviously this is not a tribal set. Knights are supported, and there's a lot of fairies and merfolk and stuff like that, but there's not going to be dedicated merfolk decks. There's not going to be dedicated fairy decks. There will be dedicated knight decks, and this is insane against those decks because it wipes all of the aggressive creatures out. But I think this is just a fine card. If you pick just one creature type that your opponent has and it doesn't really affect you that much, you might just be able to use this as a removal spell for that one creature, and it doesn't target, so there's a lot of ways that can benefit you, right? The interesting thing here too is that once you name the creature type, there's no then pumping the creatures or anything like that, right? Let's say your opponent has 2 3/3s on board. One is a fairy, one is a wolf, and your opponent really wants to save one of them with their trick. They're going to have to fire off that pump spell on the creature they really want to save before you even name the creature type, because you don't name the creature when you cast the card. You wait until it resolves, and then you name the creature type of your choice. And you get to basically kind of pick and choose. Once your opponent says okay and they let you name the creature type, that's happening. It's getting -3/-3, which is pretty sweet. I think this card is fine. It's not always going to be a blowout, but against knight decks, it's going to be really, really strong. A little bit awkward in a mirror match, right? If you happen to be playing knights and your opponent is also playing knights, this card loses a little bit of value, but even then, I think it's going to be fine. And sometimes you'll just snipe a single creature, right? There will be some one of cat or something laying around that you want to get rid of, and Witch's Vengeance is going to let you do that. Oathsworn Knight is up next. 1 black for a 0/0. Moving on, pretty bad. Just kidding, this has more text. It's a rare, it's a human knight. It enters the battlefield with 4 +1/+1 counters on it, and it attacks each combat if able. So let's stop there for a second. A hard to cast 3-mana 4/4 that attacks each turn if able. That is a fine aggressive card, especially being a knight, right? The fact that it's a 4/4 means that your opponent is going to have a little bit of trouble with it in the early game. They might have a Death Toucher, they might have something else floating around, but they're not going to have a lot of creatures that can just completely blank this. Now, there's a little bit of a downside / upside depending on what's going on. It says if damage would be dealt to Oathsworn Knight while it has a +1/+1 counter on it, prevent that damage and remove a +1/+1 counter from it. So if your opponent chump blocks this, you probably get to eat their creature. Your Oathsworn Knight is not going to die because it doesn't take any damage, but your Oathsworn Knight also gets a little bit smaller. It becomes a 3/3 instead, and this happens through the rest of the game until it gets down to a 1/1 and it finally kills itself, right? There are times that your opponent just has a giant creature on board, and it's a liability that this has to attack each combat, but most of the time this is going to get some damage in before that happens. Also note, this works favorably against Death Touch creatures. Since the damage is prevented, this will basically trade a counter for any Death Touch creature that wants to get in front of it. Plays very nicely if you have additional ways to put +1/+1 counters on it, even though I'm not sure how I feel about that. There aren't a lot of ways to actually do that in the set, and most of the cards that do aren't super strong cards. So I do think Oathsworn Knight is very strong. I'm not clamoring to first pick this card, but if I find that I'm in Knights and I open it in like pack 2, I'll feel like I was a little bit rewarded. Not a super bomby card, but it can get a lot of damage in, and it can be a little bit of a hassle to deal with over time. Black Lance Paragon is up next. It's 1 and a black for a 3/1 rare human knight with flash. I would already play that card. 2 mana 3/1s aren't exactly the bee's knees. They're not the best cards in the world. They get punished by 1/1 tokens and ping effects, as I've already mentioned in this video, but giving it flash means that you can at least use it to trade off with a creature in combat. This has a little bit of an extra upside. Whenever it enters the battlefield, target knight gains death touch and lifelink until end of turn, and that is not another target knight, it's just target knight, so it can target itself and come down and trade with basically anything, while also gaining you some life. You can also use this during your turn if you're attacking with some knights and your opponent leaves one of them unblocked, or maybe they do block it. You can kind of choose where the Black Lance Paragon's effect is going to come into play. So this plays offense and defense. It was a lot. It's very similar to the Direfleet Poisoner from Ixalan or Rivals over Ixalan, where it could play offense or defense, but it does require you to have knights, right? Actually, that's not even 100% true. You can just play this in a knightless deck, and it can always target itself, which makes it a lot better as a defensive play than a offensive play. But if you're playing an aggressive knight deck, this gets a lot better. It lets you just attack like a 1/1 or 2/2 knight into a board of giant creatures, and your opponent's just going to lose whatever they end up blocking with. You'll probably lose yours too, but you'll gain some life, so you're probably winning the race, and you get this 3/1 on board, which can start threatening more damage. So solid card. Again, not a super bomb. It's a lot better if you support it with more knights, but on its own, it's a fine playable card. A Yara, First of Locthwain, is up next. This is our triple color legendary in black. It's black, black, black. 3 black mana for a 2/3 rare legendary elf noble. When it or another black creature enters the battlefield under your control, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain a life. So that's a solid little ability. Assuming you can do black, 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 even if it's not on turn 3, this pays you off for just having dorky creatures enter the battlefield. They have to be black creatures, so this doesn't work with the raise the alarm effect or anything that makes little white tokens or anything along those lines. But you can see how this could add up a little bit of extra damage. Also plays nicely with the Cauldron Cat, but I'm not down that road quite yet. Additional ability, you can tap her and sacrifice another black creature to draw a card. I mentioned this once before, and this will probably be the last time I mention it, but there aren't a bunch of expendable creatures, right? Especially in black. There's 1 or 2 creatures that come down, do something, and then you don't mind sacrificing them. But for the most part, you don't want to sacrifice your creatures. There's not really a token strategy in black as far as the color is concerned. You can combine that with other colors, but a Yara only works if you are casting black creatures or sacrificing black creatures to her effect. So a Yara requires that you have a bunch of black creatures to really be good. But obviously if you're playing a triple black card in your deck, it's fine. Note she triggers off of herself, which is something, a 3 mana 2/3 that drains a life. Not an excellent card, but one that gives you the potential to drain 3 to 4 extra life throughout a turn, and also turn creatures that your opponent's going to kill into a removal. Seems decent. Obviously, this is also a lightning rod type card. Your opponent's going to want to kill this before anything else you have on board. So I wouldn't expect to get too much value off of the card, but if you find some sort of way to loop a black creature, maybe you have some recursive engine with the Cauldron Cat or something like that, then yeah, Yara is pretty good, and I think on her own she's a justifiable first pick. And into our bomb category, we've got a couple to talk about here. I think 4 or 5 cards I think make it into this category. Sire Conrad the Grim, not exactly a bomb, but a first pick for sure out of a weaker pack. This is 3 black black for an uncommon legendary human knight. It's a 5/4, so 5 mana 5/4 is pretty strong, right? No downside either, like quintuple upside. It says, a little bit confusing, but it says whenever another creature dies, or a creature is put into a graveyard from anywhere other than the battlefield, or a creature card leaves your graveyard, Sir Conrad deals 1 damage to each opponent. So if a creature dies, if a creature is milled, if a creature is discarded, or if a creature leaves your graveyard, you get to deal 1 damage to each opponent. That's a lot of stuff, right? This is a giant blood artist type effect, and it also pays you off for having the self-mill strategies, right? It does trigger off of your opponent milling creatures or your opponent discarding creatures, but as far as the leaves the battle or leaves the graveyard clause, that's only from your graveyard. Otherwise, it counts everything else other than itself dying. It plays really nicely in the strategy of milling your opponent out. If you mill 2 of your opponent's creatures, they take 2 damage, and you didn't really deal a lot of damage. or rather you didn't you didn't pay like a premium for this card. You still got a 5-mana 5/4 which can tussle just fine, and you have a knight, which matters a lot too. So this kind of bridges the gap between the knight deck, between the blue-black mill deck. It's just going to be a solid beater in any black deck, and this is the type of card you'll never cut. I haven't even mentioned the activated ability. For 1 and a black, each player puts the top card of their library into their graveyard, so you have the potential to mill a creature from each player, which can deal 2 damage, and you can activate this every single time you have 2 mana, right? It doesn't tap to do this, so you have the real board breaker here in Sire Conrad. Sometimes you get to a position where you just attack all in. If your opponent's at a really low life total, you send a bunch of clowns in, and your opponent is just going to die whether they block or not, because creatures going to die in combat, and they can't afford to take the damage. So Sire Conrad, definite first pick. Similar to the white legendary knight we saw, I think this card is just fantastic. Piper of the Swarm is up next. This is 1 and a black for a 1/3. It's a rare human warlock. Rats you control have menace. Great, wonderful. 1 and a black, tap it, create a 1/1 rat creature token, black rat creature token. So here's some token generation, although it is a rare, so I'm not looking to couple rares with other rares necessarily. But yeah, 2 mana for a 1/3 that can then create 1/1 menace creatures for 2 mana. That's pretty good. That gives you chump blockers. It lets you build out an army of creatures. It lets you kind of fuel any of those sacrifice effects you have floating around, even though there's not a lot of them. And then you have this mega upside: 2 black, tap it, sack 3 rats, gain control of target creature. So it's a little slow, right? This card is almost never going to get to do the last ability unless you're already dominating a game. If you get to go play this on turn 2, tap, make a rat, tap, make a rat, tap, make a rat, tap, take your best creature, then, something went really wrong. Your opponent couldn't deal with this 1/3 and your army of 1/1s. The rats having menace isn't exactly a super powerful thing, but this card's fine. There also aren't a lot of other rats floating around this set. There is a goblin in red, which can make multiple rats, which we'll talk about when we get to red. But for the most part, this is a self-contained engine. It is a card your opponent has to deal with eventually. Otherwise, you will just win the game with this card alone. But it's pretty fragile too, right? It is a 1/3. It's not super great. Sometimes you get to make some rats and your opponent kills it and you use a reanimation effect to get it back, and then you start stealing creatures, but you should expect to probably not take more than 1 creature per game if you even get that far. Again, lightning rod creature. This is going to die a lot of times before you get to do the sweet, juicy stuff you really want to do, and then once you get to that point, your opponent's just way far behind anyway. So Piper of the Swarm, easy first pick card, very good even if you're not taking creatures from your opponent, and absolutely insane if you are. Murderous Rider, this is a very easy card for people to just look at and understand why it's super powerful. It's 1 black for a 2/3 lifelinker. When it dies, put it on the bottom of its owner's library. That's actually a downside. The reason that's there is so that it doesn't hit the graveyard, and you can't start recurring it with Adventure Matters cards and start using the Adventure half over and over again, which could be pretty insane. Worth noting, this is also a knight, zombie knight, in fact. The adventure card, which makes this really, really good, is Swift End. It's 1 black for an instant. Destroy target creature or planeswalker. You lose 2 life. So, murder, you lose 2 life. You get the upside of Gale on a planeswalker, but whatever. But instant speed, murder a creature, and then on top of that, you get to pay 3 mana for a 2/3 lifelinker. That is a very powerful card. If you find ways to bounce this back to your hand, or if somehow it gets milled and you bounce it back, then you're basically bouncing back a murder rather than bouncing back a creature, which is most often what's going to happen, right? Your opponent's got to be really careful about some of their tempo bounce spells when this is the card that they would be targeting, right? Really sweet with the bounce spells that can actually bounce your own things back, though, as it gives you access to extra removal spells. You lose some life, but that's recuperated by the fact that the creature has a lifelink, and I think overall this is just an excellent first pick. You're going to be very happy to play this card, and I can't imagine there are any uncommons in the set that are going to end up being better than Murderous Rider. 2 more cards to talk about. The first one being Clack Bridge Troll, the Billy Goat's Gruff Troll. 3 black for a friggin' 8/8 trampler with haste. Okay. It's a rare, thank God. And when it enters the battlefield, target opponent creates 3/0/1 white goat creature tokens. Could be a downside. Your opponent could be taking advantage of those tokens, but they're not going to last long because at the beginning of combat on your turn, any opponent may sacrifice a creature. If a player does, tap the Clack Bridge Troll, you gain 3 life, and you draw a card. This card seems absolutely nuts to me. Your opponent has control over, right? It's similar to Desecration Demon from, I don't know, Return to Ravnica or whatever Master set that was in. Your opponent, you get this basically huge overstated creature for the amount of mana, but your opponent has the option to kind of keep you off of being able to use it. And you give your opponent a little bit of fuel towards doing that with the Clack Bridge Troll as well. But the problem is, if your opponent chooses to tap this down so they're not taking a huge hit, you get to actually draw cards and gain life. Gaining 3 life, drawing a card is huge. And if they don't tap it down, you have an 8/8 trampler with haste that's just going to run them over. So this is a damned if you do, damned if you don't type card. Yeah, you give your opponent goats, whatever. Your opponent's going to sacrifice those goats. You're going to be unkillable because you're gaining 3 life a turn, and you're just going to gain a bunch of extra life. Obviously, the way this goes wrong is if you give your opponent the goats and then they kill your Clack Bridge Troll before combat or something like that. But for the most part, I think this card is just going to dominate games that it's involved in, and it's going to be devastated against some people. Maybe you even have a way to like sweep the goats off the board, and then you get to just jam for 8 over and over again. Doesn't take a lot of hits from an 8/8 to kill the opponent, and you can't really chump block it either. It's a trampler for some reason, a black trampler. I don't really get it. All right, last card, Mythic Rare, Rankle, Master of Pranks. 2 black for an, I'm sorry, I almost said uncommon. This is a Mythic. It's a 3/3 Legendary Fairy Rogue. It has Flying and Haste, so already there. 4 mana, 3/3, Flying, Haste. That's a pretty strong card. That would already be a first pickable card out of a weaker pack just on aggro stats alone, right? But there's upside, and potentially a lot of upside. It says whenever it deals combat damage to a player, choose any number. Keep in mind that can be 0, so you don't have to do any of this, but you can have each player discard a card, you can have each player lose a life and draw a card, or you can have each player sacrifice a creature. Obviously, you have control over what's going to happen here, right? Also, you don't choose these, I believe, until resolution, so I don't think you get to pick, like, the sacrifice a creature thing, and then your opponent kills your other creatures, and then you have to sacrifice Rankle or something like that. I'm not sure how that works, but for the most part, this gives you a lot of control, right? Having each player discards a card means that your opponent, if you are playing empty-handed, you're playing loose and fast, and you're just dumping your hand out, your opponent's not going to be able to keep cards in their hand because you're always going to just make them discard a card, right? You can choose multiples of these effects too, which is kind of insane. Each player loses a life and draws a card. That's kind of neat, but it's a little awkward if you choose the discard a card and then the draw a card because you can't order that. It works in the order that you it's written on the card regardless of how you pick them, right? So if you choose the first 2 modes, your opponent's going to discard first, and then they're going to draw a card. So it doesn't keep them empty-handed, but it draws you a card too, right? And maybe you can take advantage of that first. And then each player sacks a creature. There are times that's just going to be absolutely insane. There are going to be board states where Rankle is just, a 3/3 haste creature that draws everybody cards, which is fine if you can leverage the extra card draw better than your opponent. But there are also going to be board states where your opponent can no longer play Magic because they can't keep cards in their hand, and you have expendable sacrifice creatures, and your opponent is just tapping out for big dorks, and Rankle is going to make them sacrifice that every time it hits. And this gets the little sneak attack in too, right? Where it has haste. Like, what's up with these black creatures with haste? It's kind of crazy. Anyway, Rankle seems insane to me. All of the cards in this last category seem insane, especially the ones on screen, I think are the best of the crop when it comes to black, and you should be very, very happy if you open one of these in Limited, in Draft, or in Sealed. So that's going to go ahead and do it for us. We've got a little bit of a theme, or rather a food theme running throughout black, which is going to be supported very heavily in green. But things like Bognaughty and the Cauldron Cat kind of inspire me a little bit. I think there's going to be a food deck that is viable within the format. Other than that, your typical black cards, good removal, solid late game creatures, good grindy magic, draw spells, so on and so forth. I think it's going to shape up pretty well. All right, so let's go ahead and cut it there. Next up, we'll be talking about all the red cards in Throne of Eldraine. I think there's some pretty exciting cards to talk about there. And yeah, thanks for watching. Again, if you want to go ahead and stay tuned, feel free to subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments below how you feel about the reviews, or if it's helpful, or if I missed anything, please let me know. I know I already missed the wording on a card in white, thanks to one of my viewers, so I appreciate that. And find us on Twitter, MTG_Manarok. So that's going to do it. Timothy here with Manarocks. Thanks for watching.